Hello and welcome to the Chatterbox Letters podcast. Today I will be doing another special presentation. I will be reading my second self-published book, my sequel to the Minorities, the pilot. I will be reading to everyone the Minorities, Richard's Indiscretions, Chapter 7. I hope that everyone will enjoy my sequel while I read to everyone the Minorities, Richard's Indiscretions. And this is another huge chatter letter. Chapter 7, A Time to Say Goodbye to Yesterday. It was the early Saturday morning at the Morris' household. Eddie and Charlotte Morris spent the entire day observing photographs of their son Richard as a little boy in his earlier years of life. To Eddie and Charlotte, Richard was a good little boy as though they thought, until he grew into a young man with a slew of mental problems, all of which were lowered down into the grave along with him. Charlotte began reminiscing every single aspect of Richard's short life as she pictured him from one picture after another, from the day of his birth to the days of grammar school, his little league days playing baseball with his teammates, his junior high years and starting of puberty into a young adult that he once was when damnation met its match. Charlotte began to focus on the good and pleasant years of Richard's short life, the happier times when he was really growing up as a child. Eddie, look at this. Do you remember when Richard was a little boy? He was quiet as a child. He never had any trouble with him. Yes, he was, Charlotte. He was our sweet little boy. Charlotte continued looking through the photographs of Richard. She stopped for a brief second. She came back to the one photograph that started the history of Richard Morris, who was once a good little boy growing up. Charlotte began flashbacks. Next page. To the time that she and Eddie were preparing to give birth to Richard. At that time, Charlotte's labor pains was extremely unbearable for her to take. She hung in there with courage until she gave birth to him naturally without any medication. Eddie was amazed of Charlotte's courage at that moment when she had held him in her arms. Eddie was tickled pink when he saw his son for the first time. It was one of the happier moments of their lives. Charlotte came back to reality after her flashbacks of Richard's birth. She shared the beautiful moment with Eddie. Eddie, do you remember the time I gave birth to Richard and how happy you were when you became a father that night? Yes, Charlotte. I was happy when Richard was born. I always wanted a boy, someone I can grow with, play ball with, someone to take on my good name, and now, the only living part of Richard is living at the Langstons. Thank you, God, we have Paul Robert because he is a part of Richard, always, Eddie. Yes, he is, Charlotte. He's our little grandson. Charlotte continued to look through the photographs of their family album. She spotted a picture of Richard on his first day of grammar school. Eddie started laughing when he saw the picture of Richard, first day of grammar school. Eddie had a memory when he and Charlotte took Richard to school on his first day. Charlotte, do you remember when you and I took Richard on his first day of Head Start? How scared he was? I remember Eddie. Richard almost wet his pants when he knew we were going to leave him there for a few hours with the other kids. He cried until it was almost time to come home, his teacher told us. It gave him time to get to know the other kids, Charlotte. Get the bonding thing going with the other kids and the teacher. Richard was fine, but he didn't wet his clothes. I know he was a good sport about it, Eddie. His teacher said that he was the one of the smartest kids that they had, and he was complimenting to us as parents. And now, Charlotte, we don't have him anymore, not ever again. Eddie and Charlotte became silent after the fact they will never see their son grow into an older man. Eddie and Charlotte continued looking through their family album for more photographs and memories of Richard's past time when he was growing up. Charlotte came upon a picture when he was playing in the Little League baseball. Eddie had another memory of Richard when he played Little League baseball for their community. Eddie was amazed of how talented his son was when he played. I remember, Charlotte, when the pitcher threw Richard a curveball. Richard batted that ball with the first swing of the bat. He hit his home run. He must have had 10 home runs that year, which carried his team to the championship. Eddie, it seemed as though our son was the best of everything he did back then. Right now, I just don't understand what happened. Charlotte, I just cannot understand. We can not let what happened get us down right now. We got too many memories staring us dead in our faces. Let us at least cherish the good ones for this moment, Charlotte. You're right, Eddie. The good memories. Eddie and Charlotte continued looking through their family photo album. They came upon a photograph of Richard in his junior year of school. He was at his puberty, one of the most trying times of Richard's short life. At that time when things started to turn around for Richard from being a good boy into a bad boy with certain methods of ungratefulness that he incurred on his parents. Eddie and Charlotte did not consume a whole lot of what Richard had done during his junior years of school. He did what some preteens would do when he thought he could get away with playing and joking around with the students and the teachers. His grades fell. Richard was a very smart boy. He sought out to make sure his grades were supreme before report card time, and his attendance was impeccable. Eddie and Charlotte was grateful at that time Richard even tried to be that perfect student. They often reminisced Richard's junior years of school as they looked and observed some of the photographs he took during that time. Next page. Charlotte, I remember Richard at that point in his time. Some of our trouble were just starting to brew with him. I think I realized what was going on at that point, Eddie. I just didn't want to believe he could end up like he did. I know, Charlotte. Richard bounced back and got his act together and made good grades. I often wondered why he didn't do the same thing this time around. I don't know why, Eddie. I just do not know why. We tried everything we knew how to do to get him to travel that same route he did as a child growing up. I guess there were changes with time. As the day progressed, Eddie and Charlotte continued looking through their family photo album at Richard's final year of his life during his high school years. Eddie and Charlotte were consumed with emotions as they observed the last photograph of Richard. At that moment, Sarah came over with Paul Robert and told to visit with Eddie and Charlotte. Sarah knocked on the front door. Eddie answered and invited Sarah and Paul Robert into the house. They walked into the living room where there were tons of family photos, albums lying around and about the sofa and the end tables. Hello, Sarah. How are you and Paul Robert doing today? We're super fine, no problems. My friend and I are planning a trip to Florida just to get away from the stresses of this wonderful city we live in after the big pajama party. What is this we see here in the living room on the sofa? Charlotte and I were looking through our family photo album. We were looking at pictures of Richard from when he was a child until Sarah walked up into the living room. She observed a slew of photo albums sitting around and about on the sofa and in the end tables. One of the photo albums revealed a recent picture of Richard in his final year of life. Sarah sat on the sofa with Paul Robert in her lap. She began looking through the photo album at the photographs of Richard. At that moment, Sarah was reminded of the terror Richard put her through. Paul Robert observed his father in the photograph presented by his mother. Sarah became emotional at that point when Paul Robert acknowledged Richard as his father in the photograph. Mommy, is he my daddy? Sarah acknowledged to Paul Robert about Richard being his father. Yes, Paul Robert, that's your daddy. Eddie and Charlotte observed Paul Robert looking at the photograph of Richard. Eddie came up to Paul Robert and held him in his arms with the photograph of Richard in his tiny little hands. Papi, this is my daddy. Sarah stood up from the sofa with tears in her eyes as she observed Paul Robert looking at the photograph of Richard. Charlotte came over to Sarah and embraced her. She was in disbelief of Paul Robert acknowledging Richard as his father. Charlotte had no thoughts or intentions of Paul Robert ever knowing who his father was before he was ever born. Sarah, Paul Robert never got a chance to meet his father. I know, Miss Morris. It was like Paul Robert had always known his father, even before he was born. It was like he sensed Richard as his father. Eddie, Charlotte, and Sarah was amazed by Paul Roberts' knowledge of his ratchet father. Charlotte took Paul Robert into her arms. She carried him over to the huge picture of Richard that draped almost the entire wall. So that Paul Robert could observe his father fully and faithfully in his heart. "Daddy, that's my daddy, Poppy." Sarah walked over to Paul Robert and embraced him with her motherly love while Charlotte held Paul Robert in her arms over Richard's picture on the wall. Eddie returned to the sofa where the family photo albums were placed. He looked through the rest of the photographs of Richard. Charlotte and Sarah joined him as they gathered on the sofa together. They continued with Paul Robert looking through the photographs of Richard. "Sarah, I just can't get over it, why all this happened with Richard." "Miss Morris, Richard was his own person. He wanted power and control over people that were weaker than he was. He had that over me and everybody he came in contact with and had issues with. It was not your fault that Richard ended up the way he did." Next page. "I guess I didn't want to believe that my son could be the way he was. I still love my son even in death, regardless to what he did, Sarah." The Morris, Sarah, and Paul Roberts spent the entire afternoon into the evening observing photographs of Richard along with the good memories of his childhood and the horrors that he brought upon everyone else's lives. Underneath it all, deep inside, Richard was still a good person. He was a wonderful person under all that damnation. Charlotte saw that of her son. She did not give up on him while he was alive. Richard gave up on his life himself. 3 days later, after going down memory lane with the family photo album, Eddie and Charlotte Morris visited their son at his resting place in the cemetery. With a large bouquet of flowers in hand, Eddie and Charlotte came up to Richard's grave site and placed the flowers onto his tombstone. They were at the moment of silence and prayer. Eddie could not take it anymore standing over his son's gravesite. He walked away for a moment as Charlotte began to talk to her son. "Richard, your mother is here. I really do not know what to say to you right now. All I can say is that I love you very much, son, more than you know right now. I looked at some of your pictures in our family photo album. There were a lot of good memories you left us as you were growing up. I just can't understand, son, why didn't you try to live life the way me and your father brought you up? Why, Richard? We tried so hard to give you the best. You did not even try to make it work. Why didn't you try, Richard?" Eddie looked back at Charlotte talking to Richard in death. He walked over to Charlotte and embraced her as she cried on his shoulder. Charlotte turned to Eddie with tears in her eyes. He came up to Richard's gravesite and began to kneel in front of his tombstone. Eddie was confident of his feelings towards his son. He did not hesitate to present them to his son in death. Hello, Richard. I cannot say you're doing too well, but there is something I wanted to say to you, son, is that I love you. I really do. It just hurt me when you didn't even try, son. You didn't even try to live and make things better for yourself. Why did you not try to make things better, Richard? Why? Charlotte kneeled with Eddie as they began reciting Psalms, chapter 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the path of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod, thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Amen. Eddie and Charlotte began making their way out of the cemetery as they bid their son farewell. Charlotte became emotional. She turned back and ran towards Richard's gravesite. She kneeled once again in front of his tombstone and began sobbing about his unfortunate death. Why did you leave me so soon, Richard? Why did you leave me so soon? Eddie came up to Charlotte and began embracing her as she carried her out of the cemetery. It was to be a long time before Eddie and Charlotte could ever visit their son's gravesite again. For Eddie and Charlotte, it was too painful for them to realize that it was over for their son Richard. It was especially hard to say goodbye to once was yesterday, was now and today, and unfortunately would not be forgotten. Eddie and Charlotte stated on their way home, leaving behind the past they once had with Richard for all eternity. Sarah and her father had planned to visit them when they arrived at home so they could have a chance to see Richard through Paul Roberts' eyes, never forgetting the good memories they once shared and their son Richard as a child. They had never had any thought of letting Richard go from their hearts. Eddie and Charlotte never healed from their wounds the day they visited their son's gravesite. Eddie and Charlotte thought it would not be the time to say goodbye to yesterday. The end. I would like to say it was short, but it was powerful. The ending of the Minorities, Richard's Indiscretions. I want everybody to like, share, subscribe to my podcast. Hit that notification button to know when I go live. Ring that bell for updates on my podcast. And everyone, if you have a chatter letter you would like to send to me, you can write anything you want in your chatter letter, long as it's clean, your words are clear and discreet. And I want you to send your chatter letter to the Chatterbox Letters Podcast, P.O. Box 5556, Lakeland, Florida, 33807. Everyone, please don't hesitate to send your chatter letter. Procrastinate and send your chatter letter today.